Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today we're plunging into, well, a really fascinating and maybe surprising chapter of history that still echoes today.
It really does. Think about this. Just back in 2011, you had a prayer leader in Pakistan facing life for blasphemy.
Just for removing a poster about the prophet's birthday.
Exactly. Or, go back to 2006 in India and suddenly 200 weddings had to be redone because of a religious ruling.
Wow. So these aren't just random incidents then?
Not at all. They're like direct reverberations, echoes of these really deep historical debates, these intra-Muslim rivalries.
Okay, so that's where we're heading. Back to the roots.
Precisely. Our mission today is to explore those roots in 19th century North India, to really, get a handle on what was truly at stake, beyond the simple labels we often hear.
Right, and the focus is this Barelvi-Deobandi controversy, a time when interpretations of Islam were so divergent. I mean, people didn't even see each other as proper Muslims sometimes.
It got that intense, yes. And what's so compelling, as you said, is that it challenges our easy assumptions.
Yeah, because it wasn't just, say, the learned scholars versus the Sufi mystics, or reformers versus traditionalists.
Exactly. That's the key thing to grasp. Both sides, the Barelvis and Deobandis, were full of highly learned scholars. They often studied the same books, the same curriculum.
And both were involved in Sufism.
Deeply embedded in Sufi traditions. So the real driver, the underlying cause for why these theological arguments got so heated, wasn't about learning levels or Sufism itself. It was fundamentally about the loss of political power.
Ah, okay. So the decline of the Mughal Empire, the rise of British colonialism, that massive political shift is the real engine here.
It absolutely is. Yeah. That political upheaval poured fuel on the fire of theological debates. It led to what we can call competing political theologies.
Okay, let's unpack that term, political theologies. What does that mean in this context?
Well, systems of religious thinking that were trying to figure out how power and authority should work, especially when Muslim political rule was fading.
So it shaped everything, how people saw God's role, the prophet's authority, the law.
And even just everyday stuff, how you lived your life. It became this urgent question. How do we be Muslim? How do we maintain our identity when the political ground beneath our feet is shifting so dramatically?
Okay, let's paint that picture a bit more. After Emperor Aurangzeb died in 1707, Mughal power just...
That is tanks, right?
It plummets. And by 1757, after the Battle of Plassey, the British East India Company is basically calling the shots.
And the emperor himself, just a figurehead.
Pretty much. His real power barely extended beyond the city walls of Delhi by then. It was a huge crisis of sovereignty.
A real power vacuum. And that creates space for these disputes to flourish.
Fertile ground, exactly. For the Muslim scholarly elite, the ulama, losing political power made protecting the faith, securing its boundaries from threats both inside and out, incredibly urgent.
So they started trying to define Islam more sharply.
Yes, leading to these rival groups defining Islam as a discursive tradition, which sounds academic, but basically means Islam became the site of constant argument, ceaseless contestation over what it truly means and how to practice it. And this kicks off with a major debate in the early 19th century between two big names.
That's right. Shah Muhammad Ismail and Fazli Ak Karabadi. Their clash really sets the stage for the Barelvis and Deobandis later on.
Let's start with Ismail. He sounds like quite the character, a warrior scholar, grandson of the famous Shah Wali Ullah, very focused on the texts.
He was a real force, known for fiery public activism, giving these incredibly popular Friday sermons at the main Jami Mosque in Delhi.
And his goal?
To restore what he saw as God's absolute exclusive sovereignty, to get rid of practices he thought diluted that pure focus on God.
And these sermons were controversial even then.
Oh, yes. His opponent, Kayobadi, who was actually working within the British system then, petitioned the British resident to get him banned from preaching there.
Did they ban him?
They did, initially, but Ismail managed to convince the British officials it was all about theology, not politics or rebellion, so they actually reversed the ban. Quite a moment.
So his core project was this radical reorganization of life around God's exclusive sovereignty, fixing moral corruptions, as he put it.
Yes, he saw himself as an interventionist, and he laid out four main categories of transgression that he felt undermined God's absolute power.
Okay, walk us through those. What were they?
Right. First was transgression in knowledge, believing, say, that saints have knowledge of the unseen, ilm al-ghaib, or that they can hear your prayers from far away.
So things only God should know or do.
Exactly. Second, transgression in miraculous capacities, attributing godlike powers to saints. Third was about devotional acts,
Like praying at tombs.
like prostrating at a saint's tomb as if it were divine, or making vows in a saint's name instead of God's. And fourth, even transgressions in everyday habits that might blur the lines between creator and created.
So it was really about drawing a very sharp line in theology and daily life.
Absolutely. Purity of focus on God alone, in everything, rooting out anything that even hinted at sharing God's unique status or power.
And this extended to how he viewed the Prophet Muhammad himself. He pushed back against excessive veneration.
Very strongly. He argued that portraying the prophet as more than a mere human who received God's revelation was dangerous, sort of like how he saw Christians having divinized Jesus.
He wanted to emphasize the prophet's humanity.
His perfect submission as a human slave of God. He'd quote the prophet saying things like, "Don't excessively exalt me. I am but God's slave, so call me God's slave and God's messenger." For Ismail, the prophet's greatness was his perfect servanthood.
Okay, now this leads to the really controversial part, right? This idea of imkani kiz and imkani nar.
Yes. This is where things get really intense. It explores God's absolute power, his kudra. Is God so powerful he could theoretically lie? Or could he create another prophet like Muhammad?
Wow, okay. He wasn't saying God does lie or would make another prophet.
No, not that it happens or will happen, but that God's power is so infinite, his capacity so limitless, that even these things are within his potential power.
I can see why that would cause uproar.
Absolutely. For Ismail, though, this theoretical potentiality, this imkan, was the ultimate touchstone for divine sovereignty. Believing God could do even this was proof you truly understood his absolute, unrestricted power.
Makes sense in a very hardcore theological way. And what about intercession? Asking saints or prophets for help?
Ismail saw that as totally unnecessary, illogical, and illegitimate.
Why so strongly against it?
Because, he argued, God's mercy and generosity are infinite and always directly available. Why go through anyone else?
Did he have an analogy for that?
A very powerful one. He said, imagine someone sitting right there with the king's giving them his full attention. And that person starts yelling for help from some governor far away.
Okay.
Ismail said that person must be blind or have lost his mind. Why seek an intermediary when you have direct access to the ultimate source?
That really hits home. It vividly shows his focus on that direct, unmediated connection to God. But of course, his rival Khairabadi saw things very differently.
Very differently indeed. Fazilak Khairabadi was a major scholar himself, especially known for logic, reason, and his deep roots in Sufi practice. He hit back hard.
How did he counter Ismail?
He accused Ismail of takfir, basically, declaring him an unbeliever for insulting the prophet, as he saw it. And, maybe more practically, he accused Ismail of causing social havoc with these radical public pronouncements.
So, on intercession, what was Khairabadi's view, if Ismail thought it was illegitimate?
Khairabadi argued God accepts intercession because he loves and honors the prophet. It's not a sign of God needing help, but a mark of the prophet's high status and God's favor towards him.
So it's about love and honor, not necessity.
Precisely. He felt Ismail was totally undermining prophetic munificence, the prophet's spiritual generosity and role as a conduit for blessing, and frankly, spreading hopelessness by shutting down that avenue for people.
This brings up that other point, should these tricky theological issues even be discussed publicly? Khairabadi thought, no, right? Too confusing for ordinary people.
Exactly. He argued sensitive debates shouldn't be laid bare to the masses. It just leads to chaos and confusion. Keep it among the scholars.
Whereas Islam thought the opposite. That public debate brought clarity.
He did. He believed it was necessary to bring these things out into the open for true understanding. A fundamental disagreement about public knowledge.
So looking back at this Ismail-Khairabadi clash, it's way more than just theology, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was a profound debate about how to live in this rapidly changing world, how to navigate colonial power while staying true to your faith. It's about understanding their anxieties and choices in the face of losing sovereignty.
It really gives voice to how they saw their own situation. And this initial spark, this rivalry, it didn't just die out.
No, it's sort of metastasized, you could say. As British colonial power got even stronger in the second half of the 19th century, this individual feud evolved into the larger group conflicts, the Barelvi and Deobandi schools.
Okay, so now we have organized schools of thought emerging, and you mentioned a key concept here, maslak. What exactly is that?
Right, maslak is crucial. It's more than just a school, it's a whole normative orientation. Think of it as a complete path encompassing knowledge, how you interpret texts, and how you practice Islam daily.
So each group claimed their maslak was the right way.
Yes, an exclusive claim to normativity. But the very fact that you had these competing maslaks showed the fragmentation, the instability within the wider Sunni tradition in India at the time.
And just to be clear, the core dispute wasn't about which major legal school follow. Like, they were both Hanafis.
Correct. Both Deobandis and Barelvis were deeply committed to the Hanafi school of law, and both were involved in Sufism. The fight wasn't over which law school, but, as the source puts it, what it meant to be a Sunni Hanafi Muslim under conditions of colonialism.
Okay, so same foundation, totally different interpretations of how to apply it in that colonial context. Let's dig into the Deobandi project first. Figures like SherAli Tareen were key here.
Yes, Tanvi is a major figure. The Deobandi aim was really about protecting what they saw as the core religious duties, the obligations, from getting mixed up with non-obligatory rituals.
They were worried people would mistake popular customs for essential religious acts.
That was a central concern. Protecting the primacy of religious obligations from confusion with optional practices. This leads to their focus on bidya, or improper innovation.
And Tanvi had specific categories for this.
He did. A very interesting framework, Type 1. Innovations that were new in form and cause, but were necessary to fulfill existing religious obligations.
Like what? Give us an example.
Things like writing religious textbooks, building madrasas or seminaries, even developing rules for Arabic grammar. These didn't exist in the Prophet's time, but Tanvi argued they became obligatory because they helped preserve and transmit essential religious knowledge.
Okay, so some innovation is actually good, even required. What was the second type?
Type 2 was innovations that were new in form, but not new in cause. The classic example is the Mawlid, the Prophet's birthday celebration.
Meaning, the reason to celebrate joy at the Prophet's birth existed back then.
Exactly. The Prophet and his companions had the reason to celebrate it, but they didn't do it in the way it later developed. For Tanvi, this kind of innovation was potentially heretical.
Why heretical?
Because, he argued, doing something later that the Prophet could have done but didn't casts doubt on the completeness and finality of that norm. It implies the original practice wasn't sufficient.
That's a subtle but powerful argument. And the Deobandi scholars saw themselves as guardians for the ordinary Muslims.
Very much so. They felt a duty to shepherd and protect the masses' moral health. They sometimes used strong language, comparing the masses to cattle needing strict guidance away from error.
So if even a permitted act was causing confusion,
then the elite, the scholars, had to stop doing it. Even if it was okay in itself, if the masses started thinking it was obligatory, the scholars had to abandon it to set the right example.
And this idea of purity was really strong. Even permissible things could become forbidden.
Yes, if polluted and mixed with an illegitimate act or condition. His example was accepting an invitation fine in itself. But if the gathering included forbidden things, like music or improper mixing, then attending became forbidden too. The permissible was tainted by the impermissible association.
Tanvi seems to have seen everyday life as a constant struggle for correct practice. He was very critical of popular customs, like weddings.
Extremely critical. He called lavish wedding and engagement ceremonies the greater doomsday and the lesser doomsday. Strong words.
Why such harsh terms?
Because, he said, they necessitate that which God did not deem necessary. They forced people into extravagance and social pressures that had no basis in core religious obligations. It was a distortion of priorities.
And on the Prophet's knowledge, did the Deobandis believe he knew the unseen?
Generally, no. They denied the Prophet had access to ilm al-ghaib, cited the Quran, where the Prophet says things like, "I do not know what will be done to me or to you."
So high status didn't automatically mean all-knowing.
Right. For them, status and knowledge weren't necessarily proportional. The Prophet's unique status came from revelation, and its perfect example, not from possessing knowledge that belongs only to God.
And how did they handle that tricky Ismail idea about God's capacity to lie or create another prophet?
They defended Ismail's underlying point, clarifying it was about God's infinite potential, Rudra, his absolute power. It wasn't that God does or would do such things, but that nothing is theoretically outside his capacity. Upholding divine omnipotence was the key.
Okay, that paints a clear picture of the Deobandi orientation. Now let's switch to the other side. The Barelvi project, led by Ahmad Raza Khan. How did they approach things?
Ahmad Raza Khan represented a very different, though equally rigorous approach. You can visualize their source of authority like a pyramid or maybe a deep chain. At the top, the Quran, then the core hadith collections. Below that, centuries of respected Hanafi legal texts and Sufi writings. And Khan's own extensive legal opinions, his fatwa, drew directly from this deep well. It emphasized a chain of ontological belonging, a real, substantial connection back through tradition.
And he was highly critical of the Deobandis.
Fiercely critical. He accused them of basically falsifying divine law by forbidding things he saw as perfectly permissible, even commendable.
What was his rule for deciding if something was allowed or not?
Much more permissive, fundamentally. An act is forbidden only if there's a clear, conclusive proof text. A Nasquati saying so. If there's no explicit prohibition,
then it's allowed.
Then the default is permissibility. But he even quoted a principle. The existence of an act indicates its permissibility, but the non-existence of an act does not indicate its impermissibility. Just because the prophet didn't do something doesn't automatically mean it's forbidden later.
That's a fundamentally different legal starting point. So how did he view practices like the Mawlid, the prophet's birthday celebration?
He vehemently defended them. The Mawlid, standing in reverence, qiyam, he saw these as indispensable ways to remember and honor the prophet, essential expressions of love.
So for him, banning these things was the real problem.
Absolutely. He argued that prohibiting any means to exalt the prophet by calling it heretical was itself heretical, a complete inversion of the Deobandi view.
And on the prophet's knowledge of the unseen.
Direct opposition again. Khan firmly believed the prophet did possess ilm al-ghaib, granted by God. For him, status and knowledge were proportional. The higher the prophet's status, the greater his knowledge.
And he really disliked the comparisons the Deobandis sometimes made.
He found them deeply irreverent. Comparing the prophet's knowledge, even hypothetically, to figures like Satan or the angel of death was completely unacceptable, a grave insult in his eyes.
What about Ismail's idea about God's capacity to lie or create another Muhammad? How did Khan react to that?
He launched a devastating indictment, just completely rejected it. He saw it as a horrific insult to God's perfection and majesty. Absolutely unthinkable.
Khan also seems very concerned with maintaining distinct Muslim identity in public life, especially under colonial rule.
Acutely concerned. He was vigilant about maintaining Muslim markers of distinction, fiercely opposing any imitation, tashabu, of non-Muslims.
Like forbidding visits to Hindu festivals.
Yes, things like Ram Leela or Dussehra were forbidden. And that example about distributing blessed food.
To the chummers, the low-caste leather workers.
He called it sinful, sinful, sinful. His reasoning was stark. A non-Muslim body, like that of a polytheist chamar, couldn't receive the spiritual benefit of Quran-recited food unless that body was first marked as Muslim through conversion. Very strict boundaries.
This strictness extended to social life, too, like leisure activities.
It did. Even something like hunting, for sport, forbidden, only allowed for a substantive purpose. Food, medicine, a real utilitarian streak there.
And he had strong views on women's roles, particularly at weddings.
Very strong. He forbade the presence of vulgar and morally questionable women, like professional dancers. He used this metaphor of women being like delicate glass, easily shattered by bad company. It reflects a deep concern for protecting women's morality through social control.
Wow. So you really see these two schools developing vastly different blueprints for being a good Muslim in that specific time and place, profound disagreements.
Absolutely fundamental differences, touching almost every aspect of life.
Was there anyone who tried to bridge this gap? Someone respected by both sides?
There was a key figure, Haji Imdadullah Muhajir Makkah, a highly revered Sufi master. And here's the fascinating part. He was the spiritual guide to the main Deobandi founders, like Nanatvi, Gangohi, and Thanvi.
Okay.
And also to one of their biggest opponents, Abdul Sami, who leaned towards the Barelvi side.
So he had disciples in both camps. That's quite unique. And he had moved to Mecca.
Yes, he migrated Hijra to Mecca after the failed 1857 uprising against the British. So he was somewhat removed geographically, but still hugely influential spiritually.
And he tried to mediate these disputes.
He did. He wrote a specific text, the Faisala I Haft Masala, the decision on 7 issues, aiming to resolve the conflict over key practices like the Mawlid, reciting Fatiha for the dead, and yes, even that issue of God's capacity to lie or create another prophet.
What was his goal with this text?
His stated aim was compromise and mutual understanding, to get people to stop the bitter polemical fighting. He wasn't a legal scholar in the same way as Thanvi or Khan, but his followers believed his insights came from deep mystic knowledge, directly inspired by God. That gave his words weight.
What kind of stance did he take in the FHM? Was it clearly pro-Deobandi or pro-Barelvi?
That's what's so interesting. He tried to walk a middle path. On one hand, he warned against making optional things seem obligatory, saying from repeated and undue insistence, even a commendable practice can turn into a sin. That sounds a bit Deobandi.
Right, caution against excess.
But on the other hand, he also explicitly disapproved of the intensity of his Deobandi disciples' attacks on popular rituals like the Maulid. He seemed to value the pious sentiment behind them, even if he had concerns about how they were practiced.
So trying to find a balance, did it work? Did it calm things down?
Ironically, no. His attempt at, this kind of broad, unifying interpretation, ecumenical exegesis, completely backfired.
How so?
Both the Deobandis and the Barelvis seized upon the parts of the FHM that seemed to support their view, ignored the rest, and claimed Imdadullah was on their side. It actually fueled more controversy.
Wow, so even the revered Sufi master couldn't bridge the divide. That really shows how deep it ran.
It really does. And this leads to another fascinating episode about establishing authority, the dream narrative.
A dream. Tell me about this.
A prominent Deobandi scholar reported having a dream where the Prophet Muhammad himself appeared.
Okay, dreams are significant in Islamic tradition. What happened in the dream?
Here's the kicker. The Prophet was described as being dressed exactly like a Deobandi scholar specifically, resembling Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, one of their founders.
Wait, the Prophet was dressed like a Deobandi?
Yes. You can see the implication, right? It's a powerful validation of the Deobandi way, their appearance, their stance. It cleverly subverted the normal order of imitation.
How so? Because normally you'd imitate the Prophet.
Exactly. But here, in the dream, the Prophet is depicted imitating them. Specifically their leading scholar. It's like the ultimate endorsement straight from the source affirming the Deobandi path.
That's an incredible story, and it shows how people navigated disagreements even with their own master, Imdadullah.
Precisely. The Deobandi leaders deeply respected Imdadullah, but they also had their own strong reformist vision. They found ways to interpret his guidance, maybe even deliberately dyeing Imdadullah's message in colors that best matched their reformist fabric, as the source nicely puts it.
And claiming prophetic validation through a dream helps solidify their position.
It powerfully establishes their interpretation as the correct, even divinely sanctioned. One, even when navigating differences with their own Sufi master.
Yeah.
It wasn't just theology, it was about securing legitimacy.
So let's try to wrap this up. We've journeyed through this intense period in 19th century North India. We've seen how these debates over God, the prophet, law, ritual, they weren't just abstract.
Not at all. They were absolutely central to defining what it meant to be Muslim when faced with the massive disruption of colonial power. They shaped how people lived, prayed, socialized. Everything.
And this whole deep dive really pushes back against simple labels, doesn't it? It's not just Sufis versus legalists or reformers versus traditionalists.
Exactly. It reveals these complex, competing political theologies, these different normative orientations or maslaks that were actually arguing within a shared Hanafi, Sunni, Sufi-inflected tradition. It highlights the internal diversity and contestation.
Thinking about today, the source mentions that discussions about things like religious intolerance or madrasaphobia in South Asia often miss this internal complexity.
Yes, they often lack the nuance or internal differentiation. Understanding these historical logics of life, these internal debates and how they developed, isn't just an academic exercise. The source suggests it's actually pragmatic politics. It helps us grasp the complexities of the present much better.
So, the final thought for our listeners, what should they take away?
Well, maybe consider this. How often, even in our own lives, our own communities, are the ways we define ourselves, practice our beliefs, interact with others, how much of that is tied up in historical ideas about authority, power, and what's considered right?
That's a really good question.
And how do we genuinely listen to and maybe learn from the the different viewpoints within a tradition or community without just flattening everything out or resorting to easy labels? It's a challenge that goes far beyond 19th century India, asking us to engage with the messy, complicated reality of human beliefs and practices.